Well, hello and welcome to the latest FlightGlobal webinar brought to you in association with CAE. Today, with our panel of experts, we're going to be addressing flight crew resourcing and how a battered aviation industry can repair itself, rebuild itself from the flight deck. Now, the word unprecedented is overused, but no previous crisis in recent times, from the recession of the early 90s through 9/11 to the global financial crash, has had such a devastating impact on airlines and the pilot community. Tens of thousands of pilots throughout the world have lost their jobs and perhaps their dream career. Many are experiencing disruption and anxiety as they face uncertainty and the prospect of switching employers or the types that they fly, not through choice, but through necessity. However, the airline industry is fighting back. Services are being resumed. There will be ups and downs, and there is a grim prospect of a second wave of infections. But social distancing regulations, changes in passenger behavior, and the prospect of better treatments and a vaccine have meant that we are learning to live with COVID, and aviation will return. Now, other webinars have addressed the changes that we'll see as a result of all this at airports and in the cabin and to airline networks. But the discussion that we're going to have today is going to discuss the most important part of the aircraft, the cockpit, and the men and the women who have our lives in their hands every time we fly. And we're going to be asking how employers manage that resource in such difficult circumstances. Where, if any, are the opportunities? So to debate these issues, I'm joined by three esteemed panelists. Keith Butler is Managing Director of CAE Park Aviation, a global leader in the provision of aviation personnel and services to airlines and aviation support organizations. Dr. Jeff Murray is a partner in Oliver Wyman's aviation practice and works with airlines and OEMs around the world in areas including training and operational efficiency. And finally, Andrew Kelly is Group Director of Corporate Affairs at ASL Aviation Holdings, which operates under an ACMI model, a fleet of 140 aircraft ranging from ATRs to the 747. And he wears another hat as President of the European Regions Airline Association. Now, before we kick off, a quick reminder on the format. We're live and interactive for the next 55 minutes or so. We'd love to get your questions as we go along by the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And my colleagues Chloe and Pilar are behind the scenes and will be processing your questions and dealing with any technical issues. So Keith, if I may start with you. You've worked for Aer Lingus before Park. For airlines, the past 5 or 6 months have been all about crisis management. Most have had to go through the most painful cuts and trauma that they will perhaps ever have gone through. How do they start to rebuild their cockpit resource?
So I think, Murdo, we're obviously talking to dozens and dozens of airlines on a weekly basis all across the globe. And what we've seen is that airlines' response from a crew management perspective it can really be broken down into 3 phases in terms of how they're dealing with this. So we've seen the first phase over the last couple of months, and we're still towards the tail end of it, which is the immediate reductions and those very unfortunate but necessary cuts that had to be made at very short notice and in unprecedented circumstances, as you said. But what we now see is that airlines are moving into the next real 2 phases and trying to plan for those. The first is how they manage volatility over the next 18 to 24 months, where they really don't know what the true demand is going to be in the market. And they are trying to understand with the crews that they still have, how they can build in flexibility over that period of time to be able to quickly respond to a very volatile demand environment, whilst at the same time preparing for the phase after that, which is the return, the recovery, the proper full recovery, and understand the challenges that that could bring, because that could happen quite quickly. In terms of what it means for their region or their particular airline itself. So they're trying to find ways of building in flexibility into their resourcing models over the next couple of years to respond to the environment. And many of them need help in doing so, and understanding what models are available and what new tools are available to help them achieve that.
Thanks, Keith. Now, Jeff, I know Oliver Wyman have done a lot of work around how airlines resize and retrain their pilot community. What are the particular challenges they're going to have to be aware of as they go into this possible period of recovery, this new phase of the crisis?
Well, I think is frankly probably the majority of our viewers recognize. I mean, one of the major challenges that the airlines are going to be dealing with, and in fact, one of the most significant challenges, is training. And the airlines are going to be dealing with two training-related challenges. The first is retraining the folks who are lucky enough to continue to fly on new equipment, because as the economy recovers, as we recover from COVID, airlines will grow, senior pilots will move back to large aircraft, and that's one significant challenge. The secondary challenge is taking the guys who have been furloughed and getting them back in the cockpit. And depending on how long, the crew members are furloughed, that training could be as short as, frankly, 2 or 3 weeks. Or as long as 6 or 7 weeks. So it's a significant challenge, and given the uncertainty around what the recovery is going to look like, timing that turns into frankly a very complex mathematical optimization problem. When do we recall people? How do we use the simulators? Which ones should go first? So it's a significant, meaningful challenge for the airlines, and frankly, given the depth of the furloughs that we've seen, it's a challenge that airlines in this magnitude have not dealt with, in our history. Significant, meaningful challenge.
Thanks, Jeff. Meaningful challenge. Andrew, I was wondering how ASL itself is tackling some of these issues, and also with your ERA cap on, how regional airlines are coping. We know that the problem is particularly marked among full service airlines who depend on long haul flights and the business market, but regional airlines are also highly dependent on discretionary corporate travel. So what has the effect been, including on the pilot community, both with your company and also with the regional airline sector generally?
Well, from an ASL perspective, first of all, I think it's fair to say that on the passenger side, we've been facing the same problems as every other airline, and that's no surprise. We have always, with respect to crew, we have always tried to offer the best we can in terms of flexibility with the base and flexibility with the roster. These are issues that have made us and continue to make us an attractive option for crew. But of course, the pandemic has had a huge effect on the passenger side, and we're only starting to see some recovery in this week with our associated passenger airline down in South Africa, which has only just been allowed to return to full domestic flying since Monday. So that's going to take a long time. The passenger side of the business, not just for us, but for everybody else, will take a long time to come back. The Eurocontrol assessment I saw yesterday for last week says that we're back up to about 50% of traffic across Europe and the Eurocontrol area. That seems like a lot and seems positive, but the predictions were we'd be a lot further along by the time we got to this point. On the cargo side, it's been different. Normally, a downturn would see, an economic downturn would see a downturn on the cargo side as well. Of course, that hasn't been the case here because We have had quite a boom with the online retailers, the major ones who we all know, who you know, have been very busy in the past few months, and also the standard main street stores who have been making up for lost business through online sales. And of course, we've been carrying a huge amount of PPE, personal protection equipment, over continents for people. And belly freight has largely disappeared with the passenger airlines. So there's been a huge upturn in cargo, but unfortunately an upturn that we couldn't avail of fully. Not all cargo airlines can just you know, add capacity you know, for a couple of months at a time. Excuse me. So and that will settle down as the belly freight comes back and passenger and other cargo services come back. So certainly not hit so much on the cargo side. And for pilots, as we're talking about those, and crew, the cargo became a good place to work in the last few months, because they had a lot more job security, and they were busy. They were very busy. But we negotiated with governments on their behalf and with regulators on their behalf to allow them to fly through the pandemic with the least amount of hassle and regulation and all of those horrible things that they had to go through. On an ERA side, from a regional point of view, I'd say that you know, there isn't a lot of difference between what a smaller regional airline has to cope with regard to passenger downturn in a pandemic, and what a larger LCC or legacy airline has to go through. It's all the same. If the passengers aren't there, if the passengers aren't allowed to fly, it affects the regional airline just as well. The big difference is that the reaction of the governments, who are ready to pour billions and have been pouring billions into the larger airlines and the airline groups in order to save them and keep them afloat. But they don't have the same attitude towards regional aviation. It's pretty short-sighted, because it will come back to bite. If regional airlines start going out of business, then there will be no connectivity. And this, of course, will hit the legacy airlines, because they won't have that onward flow of passengers, you know. So it's quite short-sighted, but it's something that you know, governments and Europe in this case has got to wake up to, is that, you know, the regional airlines have been hit just as hard, and they have much less opportunity to come out of this by themselves, operating from the regions, and they need some support and they need some help.
Okay, I mean, Andrew, you talked there about the sort of the short-term termism that sometimes applies, and we've, you know, most of us have been around for a long time. We remember the downturn after. I certainly remember the downturn after 9/11 and after the financial crisis. Keith, your company CAE has put out a report about the shortage of pilots and how difficult it's going to be for pilots for airlines to recruit pilots. We're seeing massive numbers of pilots being laid off. Is the industry ever going to get to that sort of equilibrium where there is a match between demand and supply? Does anyone want to come in on that one?
Yes, because I think the answer will be no, but simply because it's obviously an industry that's hit by too many different factors at a given point in time. But when you look at it from, I suppose, if you look at the question from a slightly different perspective, which is what can airlines themselves do to get their equilibrium right, is probably the best way of looking at it, as opposed to from a macro level. And I think this is a very important question that airlines need to be asking themselves now, because obviously they're very distracted in terms of survival is a key issue for them at the moment. But when you look at the market dynamics, that problem of a global supply issue can quickly resurface in a post-recovery environment. Because at the moment, what we see a lot of pilots exiting the industry. They're through retirements or through early retirements and bringing retirements forward, or through taking up careers that they may have had previously. What that means is when the recovery does happen, through both capacity issues in terms of, as Jeff spoke about, the training issues that airlines will face, in addition to recruitment issues, airlines need to now start planning for how they're going to deal with that. And that's why many of the conversations we're having within CAE is how solutions can be put in place to deal with that, because whether it's excess capacity from a training perspective, whether it's outsourcing solutions, either training outsourcing or crew management or other forms of crew resourcing solutions, will help airlines put in place the infrastructure without necessarily adding in the fixed costs, so keeping that flexibility and variable cost element, and that will help them right size at a micro level and get the demand right at a micro level, and let everyone else worry about the macro aspect to it. So I think if you're an airline, that's what you've got to do. You've got to plan for your own game and make sure you have all the components in place. And if you need external help, it is there, and many do.
I think, Murdo, a lot depends on how quick the recovery comes, and if it comes. But how quick the recovery comes. Is it going to come in the next year, or is it going to come in what people are saying is more likely, which is 3 to 4 years? You know, if it comes in the next year, there is potential that we would have an equilibrium, because we will have so many pilots who you know, probably have second careers, because that's how they financed getting into aviation in the first place. It's an expensive thing to get into. And, you know, as an aside, I would say that you'll probably find that the airline, I think you'll definitely find that the airline programs to train their own pilots will be, you know, gone by the wayside at this point. But you will have people who will have, you know, taken up second careers, who will still be available and not too expensive to bring back to being current again. But the longer it goes, the more difficult that is going to be. And we will get into a situation where, you know, it costs 100,000 for young people to you know, become a pilot. For those who have been let go, you know, it's a case of having a mortgage, having a family, needing to find a job, and they've moved on to another career, and they're very expensive then to retrain. So we'll be back to the same old story of, you know, feast or famine, which it's been for, you know, for decades in the industry.
Yeah, and I think Andrew and Keith raised a great point around, you know, the uncertainty and the flexibility that's going to be required. And one of the major items that we've begun to pay particularly close attention to is what we're calling the pilot re-shortage, which we estimate could, you know, take place in, you know, 2023 or 2024. And that's going to be precipitated by one of the strategies that a lot of airlines are adopting now. Rather than furloughing pilots, they're granting early retirement. So we're seeing in some cases in North America as much as 15 or 20% of the pilot seniority list taking an early retirement. And then you combine that with the additional retirements that'll take place in the next 3 or 4 years, we're going to be dealing with a significant shortage, you know, as early as 2023, 2024. And that's going to be driven by not only the retirements, but more importantly, the pipeline of pilots that are thinking about entering the industry now. And if history proves to be any barometer of what's in front of us during the global financial crisis, if we look in North America, student pilot certificates, prior to GFC, they were consistently at around 61,000 student pilot certificates issued every year. And that's where a pilot starts. You know, you get your student pilot certificate, then you become a private pilot, commercial, and instructor, and that kind of thing. But the foundation is the student pilot certificate. And after GFC, those student pilot certificates decreased by almost 35%, largely driven by the economic environment that folks saw. They said, oh my gosh, Pilots are being furloughed. Is this really a career? Is there ever going to be, Murdo, to your point, any level of balance between supply and demand? So folks chose, just as Andrew noted, other avenues to generate income. So it took 5 years beyond that for the industry to even partially recover from a student pilot certificate perspective. So there's two big challenges. One is the folks that are going to leave the industry. Let's call those the retirements. And the second one is this constricted pipeline that is being driven by the immediate economics that folks see now. Is it just doesn't look like it's an attractive value proposition. But in fact, in 4 or 5 years, it may in fact be a very attractive value proposition. So it's really, a really meaningful conundrum.
You might add seniority as another issue there, because as a third issue, because we're seeing the sort of atypical approach to furloughing and redundancies at this point, where it's not being based on straight seniority as it used to be. And airlines will have to tell you themselves why they're doing this, but we could have a real gap in the middle of all of the available pilots, where you've got aircraft, but you don't have the seniority to actually put qualified people in the front.
I was just going to come to this question, actually, Andrew. You preempted my next question, which was going to be about seniority. And the seniority principle, of course, has largely governed the industry, particularly in North America, but also in other parts of the world, where the most experienced and I guess the oldest pilots tend to get to fly the most prestigious types. How do you see the crisis affecting that seniority principle? Because it's affected everyone. There's been senior pilots, there's been new pilots being made redundant. How do you think, as we emerge from this, things might change? Jeff, have you got a view on that?
We do, and frankly, and I'm a former airline pilot, and I have a lot of respect for the seniority model, and I don't think the seniority model is gonna go away. I think it serves a meaningful purpose in terms of how pilots are going to be, measured, rewarded, and compensated for their tenure at the airline. So I don't see the seniority model really changing in any meaningful way. What we do see is the opportunity, and Andrew mentioned this in particular. A lot of pilots have other careers. They have other ways to generate income. So if we rewind the clock to just a year ago, we were looking at a significant pilot shortage around the world. And I think there's going to be opportunities for airlines to embrace, we need to be careful how we characterize this, part-time employment. And what that means is a pilot will be able to generate income, somewhere else, and they'll be able to fly and contribute in a meaningful way to the airline. And is the flight crew members who are watching this webinar know, the average pilot generally flies, 70, 75 hours per month. What's interesting is to put that in the context of my position at Oliver Wyman. A lot of the consultants that I work with will work, frankly, that much time in the course of a week. So there's an interesting, interesting bookends with respect to how crew members will be able to deploy their talent in different ways. So I think, the seniority model is going to remain in place. And if anything, we'll see an evolution towards the recognition that pilots have other capabilities. They can contribute to the airline in other ways, and finance and supply chain and marketing, while flying the line, perhaps not 70 hours a month, but perhaps 30 or 40 hours a month. So I think we're going to see an evolution in this employment model, not only in North America, but in other places around the world.
I think if I could just build upon that, because I agree that we're already seeing airlines really examine this, and it goes back to the what this crisis has brought into focus is the fixed versus variable cost structure of airlines, and over the years airlines have really tried to deal with that by outsourcing things like ground handling, outsourcing maintenance, which builds a variable cost element because you're buying something as a service as opposed to building a fixed infrastructure. The whole crewing area and crew management area hasn't really been touched by that kind of thinking and that kind of economics over the last period of time. And we're now seeing airlines beginning to examine that and understand where and if it might be applicable in their particular case. But even in a first instance, I think by necessity for the next 18 months, they have to have some variability within their operation model, whether that's seasonal working, whether that's reduced hours topping up in some sort of flexible way. And the real question is how much of that will stick in a long-term basis, how much of that works, because we have a unique opportunity for airlines where by necessity they're going to have to trial new and innovative ways of embedding flexibility. And what we're seeing when we're working with them is that there's more of an appetite now than there has been in the past. What that means for pilots is it means that the working environment becomes very different. It means that they have to look at what a career and a role is in a slightly different way to what the way they may have had up until now, with inbuilt flexibility into it.
Yeah, well, from a regional perspective, if I talk about the regional industry for a second, you take the fixed versus variable cost on one side, and you turn it into fixed versus variable pay on the other side. And the regional sector has benefited for many years from senior pilots moving on from legacy carriers, if you like, and taking on roles in regional carriers that get them home every evening, which they've never been used to before. And that sort of model could actually work with regional airlines in the future, where you have more senior people who fly less hours and more junior people who are more willing to fly longer sectors and longer hours, on a fixed and variable pay structure.
Okay.
The other important dimension to think about are the folks that are entering the workforce now, which are largely millennials. And Oliver Wyman conducts a flight operations briefing, a survey of leaders every other year. And when we did our most recent survey, we looked at those millennials, and one of the areas that they find attractive is the ability to contribute in different ways as an employee. So the notion of just being a pilot is not as attractive as saying, okay, I can be a pilot and I can work in marketing, or I can do a little work in finance. And if anything, the airline industry in particular has this remarkable dimensions to it that enable that kind of employment, where somebody who's 20 or 23 years old who is able to fly an airplane could fly an airplane for 3 years and then work in marketing or finance or another part of the airline, and you don't have that type of flexibility in other careers. So we think it's one of the areas that the airlines, frankly, could really exploit moving forward.
Well, thanks, Jeff. You mentioned there, and Andrew did as well, but pilots at the start of their career. I want to bring in some audience questions. I'm delighted that we're getting quite a few questions through now. I've got one from Toralp Aaron in Berlin, and he's talking about cadets. If you're a student at the moment, a student pilot, do you continue your training for the next year or so in the hope that things might recover? Or, as he says, do we just give up our dreams and look for other jobs? And will airlines that have, and this was touched on before, but will airlines who have their own academy let go of the idea of training their own pilots?
So if I can jump in, I think absolutely not to give up on your dreams, and I'd be answering that as a question in general, whether you're a cadet or whether you're aspiring anything. But there's a couple of things. And firstly, because what you're embarking upon as a cadet is a career. And what we've said up until now is that the outlook from a career perspective doesn't change by periodic crisis. And if you're entering the airline industry, you got to be prepared for these periodic crises that happen every period of time. So yes, undoubtedly, it still remains an attractive proposition. However, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to be flexible, because the recovery will not be linear. It will not be the same region by region. It will not be the same sector by sector. So it's a case of being flexible in terms of securing that first job. But also in terms of the requirements that airlines would have, as Jeff said and Andrew, as the way this has impacted upon seniority means that it isn't just, you cannot just assume that the requirements are going to come in at the high end or the high hour element. Depending upon the pace and the shape of this recovery, there will be requirements across different sectors for different levels of experience.
Yeah, I'd make a couple of points. The first is that management in airlines have got to one of the aims or the tasks is to maintain a balance, to manage for now, but also manage for the future, to scale back now where it's necessary, but be able to ramp up and have the flexibility to ramp up in the future, and not find you're in an area of pilot shortage. One thing I would say is that while I do think airline academies may decide to cancel their programs, at least, or suspend their programs for a while. For anybody who's looking at it as a career, and it's generally pilots who enter their career enter it because this is what they really want to do with their lives. And if this is what they really want to do with their lives, then as Keith says, don't give up on that. Go for it. It may take a little longer to get in, but go for it. And I'd also say, don't expect that you're going to be flying a Dreamliner on day one. Look at the regional sector, look at the opportunities there, and in particular, look at cargo. Cargo has not always been, the most glamorous of pilot jobs, but it is the steady eddy, as our HR director calls it. It is the steady eddy. It keeps going year after year, and the jobs can be very secure.
I think you've kind of answered a question from Peter, who's an ATPL cadet due to finish by Christmas, who asks about, if there's an upturn of any sort, why would airlines be interested in cadets when the market will be full of type-rated, low-hours pilots who were recently made redundant?
Well, I think it's a great question. I'm happy to take a crack at that. But the fact is, there are going to be folks who are furloughed, who hold the ATP, but it is a limited pool of individuals. So folks need to think beyond a year or two. They need to be thinking to 2023 and 2024, when, by our estimate, jobs are going to be plentiful. And if we see a vaccine quickly, and if the industry recovers quickly, it could be even earlier than that. So to answer the question directly, that pool of individuals, the ones who are furloughed, who are holding the ATPs, who aren't flying now, those are going to be brought back, flying the line very, very quickly. And it won't be long after that the airlines will be looking to their, cadet programs and their upstream programs to say, okay, who is going to be flying for me 2 and 3 years from now? Because that's the folks that need to be engaged. And as Keith and Andrew know, there's been a whole initiative, if we rewind the clock literally only 9 months, where airlines were reaching out to high schools to say to high school students, hey, you need to consider an airline career. Here's an academy program. You can be sponsored for it. Your tuition can be partially deferred and that kind of thing. So this is, and Keith, you emphasize it, this is a long-term play.
And a question that's, again, we've touched on this, but you might want to come in again just to elaborate, from a question from Maximilian Berger, I think it's pronounced. And talking about a point you touched on, Jeff, that the industry could get hit with a supply constraint of new first officers around that sort of 2022, 2023 period. What does the panel think about how airlines will respond to this scenario, and how does the flight training industry respond to this as well?
So if I could just begin, I think I think the capacity is still there in terms of bringing people through. So I think as long as cadets continue to progress, and as long as the industry keeps developing its training capacity for a future scenario as opposed to the current scenario, I think you'll still have that pipeline coming through. I think what you also need to be aware of is that there's significant fleet changes occurring within airlines, particularly with the retirement of a lot of wide body fleets. So the actual shape and around what the return looks like from a type rating perspective is something for cadets and new entrants to really keep a close eye on, as well as what's happening in those lesser, let's say, known sectors, such as Andrew pointed out, cargo or regional operations or business aviation, commercial aviation, which is a real opportunity as well. So I think cadets need to be very clear as to from a type perspective as to what the market is like, and I think the industry itself, through players like ourselves as well as airlines, will have to make sure we're future-proofing the capacity to deal with the scenario that Jeff is referring to.
Yeah, and you touched on it there, Keith and Andrew and Jeff. You both talked about this. Which sectors, where do you think the first opportunities will be? Andrew, you talked about regionals, you talked about cargo. Where will the first opportunities come from? Where will the growth begin?
Well, you see, the first thing you must recognize, I think, is that, airlines are not, not sitting down waiting for passengers to come back. They're actively out there trying to open routes, opening new passenger marketing channels, new passenger marketing ideas and initiatives. And they're going to push and will continue to push, the passenger airlines I'm talking about now, they're going to push to bring passengers back as soon as they can. And that means that as that happens, and as we come out of the virus, I mean, if we have an effective vaccine within the next 3 to 6 months, you could see a rapidly recovering airline industry by this time next year, by summer of next year. It's a question of confidence, and it's a question of people being confident to travel and also being confident economically. But it could come back fairly quickly. The passenger airlines will be trying to bring it back fairly quickly, and then they will have to ramp up. And they don't want to lose the talent that is out there. I mean, it's fair to say they can't pay for that talent now, but they don't want to lose that talent. They want it on tap. So, it's a question of how far can they go before they have to bring it back.
I just want to touch on some of the perhaps the psychological issues of losing your job and or being furloughed. When you've got pilots who are, say, perhaps doing their dream career, who are maybe at the start of their career or maybe very experienced, and they're furloughed, what are some of there are obviously technical tests that they need to pass to resume flying, but what are some of the psychological, the mental challenges, the confidence challenges that pilots face when they return to flying after a long period of absence?
I'm happy to take a crack at that. I mean, Andrew, Keith, do you want to chime in first, or?
No, you far ahead.
Okay, well, Murdo, I'm actually a furloughed pilot. So at one point in my career, I was a furloughed pilot, and I think, resilience is a key element of this. And Murdo, I know, for example, in your publication, you've tapped into a lot of individual pilots who have provided their perspective, and I think one of the main themes that you see emerging from that is around, resilience. And pilots are taught that, because every time you go through a training event, you may get dinged here and there, and you're just taught to recover. So I think in a furlough environment, it's obviously a hit on your income. It's a hit on your well-being. But the majority of the guys that I know that are furloughed have other capabilities. They figure out other ways to tap into the skill set that they have is flight crew members to contribute meaningfully, outside of the, outside of the cockpit. And then when you get recalled, there's a whole formal process and discipline around preparing for training and going through training. And then there's also a really important element, frankly, of camaraderie and friendship that is generated when you go through training. So there's an environment that welcomes you back into the cockpit. And then, on the inverse of that, when you were, dismissed or furloughed, you're relying on your inner, creativity and resilience to get through that. And I think there's actually a quote from one of the individuals in one of those articles who said, look, you're not a pilot until you've been furloughed. So I think that it's an unfortunate reality. And I think the folks who have gone through the training and the preparation are generally able to get through that.
If I could just add, Murdo, there's a lot of supports out there for pilots during this difficult period. I know we in CAE have provided access to simulators. We have various services that are available for pilots to avail of to maintain either their currency or to keep that exposure in terms of simulator hours. And in addition, we recently launched a new online platform, airsides.com, which is designed to provide a lot of support and advice for pilots during this, both in terms of career, but also welfare and mental well-being during this period of time, in addition to tips around training. So pilots are not on their own during this period of time. It's a group which has a big community, and through companies like ourselves, we've provided platforms and support services available to them.
Yeah, and that's great, actually, Keith. That those supports are there, because being furloughed or being made redundant, pilots are human just like everybody else, and it does have a psychological effect. It has to have a psychological effect, and in some cases, people in other industries can be made redundant or can be furloughed, but it doesn't mean that they have to move home, move city, move country, whatever. But it can often mean that in the airline industry, and that's tough, and so it is good that those type of supports, are there. But the other point is, and Jeff mentioned it, is that it costs so much to get into the industry that people generally fund this through second careers during their training and even afterwards, and that is a sort of a half a get out clause, which allows them to get on with life until they get back in the cockpit. And then to one of the points you asked, I don't think that pilots generally have a confidence issue when they get back onto the flight deck. It's not something they generally suffer from, but they're well trained individuals, and they know their job and they want to be there. And so I don't think there'll be a lack of confidence in returning pilots.
We talked about seniority, senior pilots. We talked about cadets, students coming into the industry. What about the people, I suppose, in the middle? Someone like Simon has asked a question here about, he's a pilot with around about 1,000 hours of multi-crew experience. His airline went bust before just as the virus hit. Pilots like that, what are the particular challenges for pilots like that, and how do you see them getting back into the industry?
So I think frankly the most likely avenue is fairly an obvious one, and it's networking. So you've got to have a broad network, and there are so many resources available to connect pilots to pilots. Keith mentioned some, and there's several other programs, but it's staying connected, it's staying aware of opportunities, it's getting at bats, at airlines, even if they're not in the process of hiring, but ensuring that your resume is updated, that folks are aware of your background, so that when this recovery takes place, and again, as we've all said, the uncertainty around the recovery right now is remarkable. There are folks who are saying, we could be back in as short as 18 months or as long as 3 or 4 years. So that uncertainty is something that can be exploited at a personal level. You know, expanding a network, making sure folks know that, you know, that I've got capabilities that are going to be needed, you know, at some point in the future.
I think.
Sorry, if I could just say something I've said before, but I think it's just worth repeating here, is that, you know, the newest, shiniest airplane or the biggest salary is not necessarily the best thing to go for in a situation like this. You know, sometimes you need to look at who you're going to work for and choose your employer wisely, and look beyond you know, the Dreamliners and the A350s, and look to see where there is a job that's going to get you into your career. And Keith mentioned it earlier, this is a career, it's not just a job, you know. So look to see where you can start your career, perhaps in a cargo airline, which we would recommend, obviously, or in a regional airline, which I would also recommend. And you can, you know, you can build your career from there, and be a lot safer there, safer in an economic sense, in terms of getting over the first few years.
I think, Murdo, if I was to summarize what Jeff and Andrew were saying, and put it, there's three factors that any pilot looking to try and get a job needs to build in flexibility within this current climate. One is where they want to work. So because we're seeing huge regional variances in terms of where jobs are available. The second is the sector. As Andrew said, cargo sector has not been as affected as much as passenger, but you also have ACMI, business and commercial jet sectors and other smaller sectors. And then the final component is the aircraft type, because different aircraft types will recover based upon at different paces based upon the demand profile. Keep all of those in mind when you're searching. In addition to keeping that networking approach, being as visible as possible and as active as possible is the route to success.
Excellent. Well, I want to combine two questions now, and I think the first one you've more or less answered, but it's someone asking a question from the other side of the career spectrum, if you like. So he or she is a first officer with thousands of long-haul wide-body hours at the age of 45. Do they assume that their career is over? If there's a 5-year recovery, they're going to be 50. Is their career over? And another question, just to add to that, are pilots and the it's a whole industry going to have to be a little bit more flexible about where they work, becoming more globally mobile, looking at opportunities around the world, perhaps, rather than looking at working for one airline, one employer for the whole of their career?
Well, I can jump in to start if that's so. 45 is not old, and particularly when you're close to that age yourself, you realise that it's younger than it used to be. Firstly, no, as we spoke about with regards to the seniority and the market dynamics, having that level of experience become a very valuable commodity. Particularly if there's command shortages as a result of a spike in retirements. So I think that's a good place. It's all about timing, though. Could I say it's the next 12 months? No, but the question is what happens thereafter. The second is the flexibility is essential. We're seeing both in the short term and the long term. Because in the short term, we're seeing that this is impacting. I mean, we've seen a recovery in the Chinese domestic market. We're actively recruiting for positions in that. We're actively recruiting for positions in the cargo sector, but those jobs are not necessarily in traditional core hubs around Europe. But I think that flexibility has always been a part of the aviation industry. I think it's not unique. It's one of the benefits of having the qualification. If we go back to the sales pitch to the cadets, is if you want to see the world, it's a qualification that's recognised the world over. So it has been an issue. people aren't always in that situation, or can't do that for family reasons. But it's going to be more important in the next 12 to 24 months, and thereafter in a normalized environment, you might be in a better position to pick and choose your location.
Jeff and Andrew, or Andrew, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, well, I think we mentioned the seniority earlier, and I certainly think 45 is definitely not old. But it's you know, from a seniority point of view, we will see a lot of older pilots deciding to take early retirement. They'll be offered packages. They are being offered packages at this point, and we will also see pilots being furloughed or made redundant at the other end with very little experience. So when we get this return, it's, you know, getting the right couple of people, you know, in on the flight deck who have the correct level of experience, you know, so you know, the questioner here could well, you know, find that that he's a bit sought after with that level of experience, you know. So I certainly wouldn't be thinking that his career is over by any stretch of the imagination.
Jeff, do you have a point to make on that?
No, I would just echo that. I would say 45 is mid-career. I've got a friend of mine who 2 years ago was in a new hire class at a major, you know, North American network airline, and there were two guys in his class of, I want to say, around 80 folks who were 57 years old, and they were in a new hire class at a major, you know, North American network airline. So I think, you know, the age element is part of the calculus, but I don't think it's the key part of the calculus. And I also think the industry is recognizing that, because as we all know, in the US, the retirement age was moved from 60 to 65 about 7 years ago. And in other geographies like Japan, it's actually 67. It's even older. So if you're able to, you know, retain your first class medical and, you know, fly on the flight deck, then age, I think, is going to become less of an attribute than it has been historically.
That's great. So hope for younger pilots and hope for older pilots as well. I want to just ask one final question from the audience, and that's something that I know is very close to the heart of CAE, because you've done a lot of work on this, recruiting women pilots. The number of women on the flight deck is shamefully low, 5-6%. With the crisis, it's going to be difficult for pilots everywhere, I guess, for the next year or so, perhaps longer. How do you persuade women now to choose piloting as a career?
Well, I think if there's one thing anyone takes from this podcast is it should be hope from a career perspective, because all three of us, despite us coming at the industry from different perspectives, have all agreed in terms of the long-term outlook. Yes, it will be a difficult couple of years, but the fundamentals, if you look at it over a 5-year plus period, are still robust. And to that regard, certainly from one of the things the industry was really beginning to get to grips with before this crisis was the fact that half the global population was not being actively mined for resourcing. And I know we at CAE have undertook a huge amount of initiatives, both on our own and with partner airlines, to try and really encourage female pilots. So the career prospects are still as good once we get through this crisis. The support mechanisms there and the role models for female pilots exist, and it's as good a career option as it's ever been, and we would really encourage it.
Excellent. Well, we've got about 5 minutes to the end of our webinar, and I'm sorry we're not able to take all the questions. We have lots of questions today, actually, which is great, but unfortunately, we can only get through so many of the audience questions. But I always like to finish these discussions, which can be in the current climate a bit gloomy, on an optimistic note, and perhaps looking at the year ahead, looking at a year from now. Where do you see the industry and flight crew resourcing being in the middle of 2021? Crystal balls out.
Well,
Who wants to start?
well, from an ASL perspective, I think we're going to spend the next year and we'll still be in recruitment mode. That's particularly, I would have to say, on the cargo side. And we expect to keep, just on the last point, to keep recruiting female pilots as a priority. And one thing I'd say to ladies who are thinking about it is that, you know, the seniority system that, you know, Jeff likes so much does actually mean that you know, unlike other industries, ladies are paid just as much as men. So and that is actually a big point for women going into an industry is that they are treated equally in terms of pay. But going back to your question, I would say the you know, it really does depend on the pandemic. It depends on the arrival of a vaccine. Anybody who has a crystal ball is taking your money and not giving you value because it's impossible to say what will happen. I'm inclined to think that there will be a vaccine and that there will be an upturn. If we get a vaccine in the next 6 months, you will find that passenger marketing will ramp up and that passenger travel will increase hugely because people are just so tired and psychologically so tired of lockdown in every country. And I think travel will ramp up again fairly quickly. If we still have a pandemic in 6 months' time and we're still going through lockdown, then the industry will go into a dark place for another 3 or 4 years, I would say. So it really depends on what happens. From a regional airline perspective, I would say, you know, European governments and European regulators need to be aware of the fact that, you know, it's not just about flying people between continents, it's about flying people between regions. That's what the economy is based upon. It's based on socioeconomic factors, and therefore they have got to rescue the regional airlines who need it just as much or even more than the legacy airlines.
Thanks. Keith and Jeff, in about 30 seconds each, 30 seconds to a minute each, where do you see us being in a year's time?
I think similar to Andrew, I think whilst there could be, I think it will still be variable from region to region and hopefully with the first signs of recovery. And I think the strongest airlines that will come out of the recovery will be those that have been innovative, have migrated to a variable cost and crew management approach through various initiatives, including outsourcing.
And I think, Murdo, to just wrap up, I think we're going to be in the midst of the recovery a year from now. But I think importantly, what we're going to see is an evolution towards greater engagement with flight crew members. And that's going to be whether they're, you know, on a furlough, on an overnight, in training. But I think we're going to see much more meaningful levels of engagement. And then I'm sure, as Keith is aware, I think we're going to see an evolution to what we're doing right now, which is more distance-based interaction, and that lends itself very well to the training environment. So I think we'll see a recovery, engagement, and an evolution in training.
Well, thanks very much. That brings us to the end of our webinar today. I'd like to thank once again our 3 panelists, as well as our sponsor CAE, and all of you who took part and asked questions for helping us to have such an enlightening and interesting debate. So look out on the FlightGlobal.com website for details of future webinars. We're going to be looking, among other things, at the post-COVID airline cabin and how business aviation is flying through the turbulence. And we're also going to be finding out more about intelligent design. So until then, stay safe and thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.